The medical bay on the Stellaris outpost carried this strange smell, like over-sanitized chemicals, mixed with the feeling that things had already gone very, very wrong. I watched Dr. Talriven, a Quillarian with 12 thin sensory tendrils and a personality so cautious it bordered on paranoid, study the incoming casualty report using 3 of his 4 eyes, while the 4th one quietly checked the emergency sedative inventory. And then he checked it again, and then again. That made 3 times in less than 3 minutes. "Please tell me this is just a typo," he muttered, his translator chip converting his usual whistling clicks into standard galactic speech, though it still carried a heavy layer of irritation. Nearby, Nurse Drimka quivered nervously. She was a gelatinous Sulvane, a species that had evolved on a world where the deadliest thing around was apparently a very angry patch of moss. "I wish I could say that, Doctor," Drimka replied, "but the field scanner is very clear. Human." "Male." Then she hesitated. "Designation: Adrian Locke. Current condition: well, technically he's still fighting." "Fighting?" Talriven's tendrils snapped straight up. He stared at the report again. "This document clearly states that he has a compound fracture in the left radius and ulna, 3 broken ribs, a punctured lung, significant blood loss, and a concussion severe enough to knock most species unconscious immediately." Drimka wobbled. "Yes, and according to the field report, he's currently wrestling a Draxian razor beast." "A what?" Before Drimka could explain further, the doors to the medical bay slid open with a loud hiss. 2 Kelvorian security officers stumbled inside. They looked like someone had taken a praying mantis and somehow merged it with an extremely stressed-out accountant. Between the 2 of them, supported under each arm but somehow still mostly walking on his own, was the human. That would be me, Adrian Locke. And judging by how I looked, it was pretty obvious I had recently made close personal contact with a Draxian razor beast. In other words, I looked like I'd been tossed into an industrial shredder, yanked back out, and then shoved through the machine again just to be sure. My left arm hung at an angle so wrong that it made Talriven's stomachs twist. All 3 of them. Blood, way more blood than anyone should reasonably have inside their body, had soaked through my ripped uniform. My face had turned into a patchwork of bruises, and every time I took a breath, there was this wet, rattling sound in my chest that normally would have meant someone was about to die. The weird part? I was smiling. "Hey, Doc," I said, my voice rough and gravelly, but still carrying that particular brand of human attitude Talriven had come to recognize as cheerful stubbornness in the face of complete disaster. "Sorry about the mess." I shrugged a little. "That razor beast had some serious personal space issues." At that moment, Talriven's tendrils went completely limp. That, apparently, was his species' stress response. He knew it was happening. He still couldn't stop it. "Sit down," he finally managed to say, though the words came out sounding more like a panicked whistle than actual speech. "Sure thing," I replied. "Just give me a second." I took 2 steps toward the exam table. Halfway there, I swayed like a tree getting pushed around in a strong wind. I paused, steadied myself, and then managed to shuffle the rest of the way over before sitting down on the table, all by myself, without passing out. The 2 Kelvorian officers looked at each other with their compound eyes, which Talriven had learned usually meant they were communicating on some private frequency. Judging by their expressions, that silent conversation probably translated roughly to, "What in the name of the cosmic void are we looking at?" "Report!" Talriven demanded, pulling out his diagnostic scanner while doing his best not to think about the inconvenient fact that his patient should already be dead. The taller Kelvorian officer, Zareth, clicked his mandibles nervously. "We responded to a distress call from Sector 7, he explained. A razor beast had escaped the xenobiology containment facility. When we arrived, we discovered this." He gestured vaguely in my direction. "By this, do you mean the human?" Drimka asked while preparing the tissue regenerator. Her tentacles were shaking so badly they looked like they were performing some kind of interpretive dance about terror. "I mean the human standing on top of a dead razor beast," Zareth clarified, while using his broken arm to wave at us and asking if we knew any good places to get what he called a beer and possibly some nachos. The room fell silent. I coughed, winced from the pain, and then laughed. It wasn't a long laugh, and that awful wet sound came with it, but it was definitely still laughter. "To be fair," I said, catching my breath, "I was really hoping the cafeteria might still be open. Fighting makes me hungry." "Fighting makes you hungry?" Talriven's voice climbed into a pitch he usually reserved for emergencies, like when the station ran out of its version of coffee. "You currently have a hole in your lung." "Just a small one," I replied calmly. "There is no such thing as a small hole in a respiratory organ." "Well, it's not a big one either." Talriven paused for what humans would call a deep breath, which was pretty ironic under the circumstances, and then activated his scanner. A holographic display appeared in the air, showing the internal condition of my body in extremely uncomfortable detail. The moment Talriven saw the results, he looked like he wished he'd chosen a different profession. Something calm, something relaxing, maybe diffusing antimatter bombs or negotiating peace treaties with the Hive Collective, because the damage inside me was extensive. Honestly, catastrophic would have been a fair word. The compound fracture in my arm had somehow avoided cutting any major blood vessels, which was either a miracle or evidence that whoever designed human anatomy had a very dark sense of humor. My broken ribs had punctured my left lung, which was running at maybe 40% efficiency. The concussion clearly showed swelling in the brain. There were bruises, cuts, and signs of internal bleeding all over the place. And yet somehow, my heart, that stubborn four-chambered engine that humans run on equal parts caffeine and pure spite, was still beating steadily. My blood pressure was low, but stable. My remaining lung had kicked into overdrive, compensating aggressively. Even the swelling in my brain had already started to go down. As Talriven stared at the scanner in frozen professional horror, it also showed something else beginning to happen. My cells had already started repairing themselves. No surgery, no treatment, just happening. "That's impossible," Talriven whispered. "What's that, Doc?" I asked, leaning forward slightly before deciding that was probably a bad idea. "Your species is impossible," he said flatly. "You should be dead. Based on your injuries, you should have died about 37 minutes ago." I shrugged carefully. "Yeah," I said, "I've been told I'm pretty hard to kill." I said it the same way someone might comment on the weather. Nice weather, calm weather. The kind of weather that definitely didn't involve holes in its lungs. By the time Drimka finished setting up the medical equipment, she had drifted a little closer to the exam table. Her gelatinous body trembled so much that even I could tell she was seriously stressed out. "Doctor," she asked nervously, "should we prioritize repairing the lung first, or should we stabilize the fracture?" "Both," Tal Riven replied immediately. Then he flicked several tendrils toward the instruments. "At the same time. And someone run a complete metabolic panel, because I need to figure out what kind of biological war crime is keeping this creature alive." "Hey," I protested, sounding way more energetic than a guy in my condition had any right to. "War crime is a little harsh. We usually call it an evolutionary advantage." "Advantage?" Tal Riven repeated dryly. He positioned the tissue regenerator above my chest and watched the device struggle to map the damage through the complicated mess of human muscles and bones. "Your species," he said slowly, "appears to be held together almost entirely by stubbornness and a refusal to acknowledge basic biological limits." "Pretty much," I admitted. Just then the medical bay's main computer chimed and displayed the results of the metabolic scan. Tal Riven studied the numbers. Then he read them again. Then he checked the scanner itself, just to make sure the machine hadn't decided to start inventing nonsense data. "Your blood," he said carefully, "has a clotting efficiency 17 times higher than the galactic standard." He stared at the screen. "Your pain suppression system is currently flooding your nervous system with enough natural sedatives to knock out a Kelvorian." Another pause. "Your cells have already begun repairing the fracture site, and your adrenaline levels are, this cannot be correct. At this concentration, adrenaline should have triggered cardiac arrest." I shrugged with my one good shoulder. "Yeah," I said casually. "Humans are kind of built different." "Built wrong would be more accurate," Tal Riven muttered. Despite sounding like he was questioning the fundamental logic of the universe, he started repairing my lung with careful precision. His tendrils moved expertly while his expression slowly shifted toward existential dread. "Who designs a species that runs on controlled system failures?" he asked. "Hey," I replied, "it works." "It absolutely should not work." At that point, Officer Zareth cleared his mandibles awkwardly. "Doctor," he said, "there is something else we should report." "What?" "During the confrontation, we observed the human throw the razor beast against a wall using his functional arm." Tal Riven's tendrils froze halfway through the lung repair. "You threw a razor beast?" he asked slowly. "Yes," Zareth confirmed. "A razor beast that masses approximately 300 kilograms." "And he threw it?" Tal Riven repeated. "Quite a distance," Zareth added. "It actually left a large dent in the wall." "With the arm that wasn't broken?" Tal Riven asked. "Correct." The doctor slowly turned his attention back to me. To my credit, I at least looked a little embarrassed. "It was kind of a heat-of-the-moment decision," I explained. "The thing was trying to eat my face, so I figured, hey, let's see what happens if I just yeet it." "Yeet it," Tal Riven repeated in a completely flat tone. "Yeah, you know," I said. "Throw something with maximum force and enthusiasm." "I am aware of what yeeting means," he said irritably. "The translator chips were updated last cycle specifically because humans kept inventing words that made absolutely no linguistic sense." Then he looked back at the scan results. "What I am trying to understand," he continued, "is how." "I mean, I work out," I said. While we talked, The tissue regenerator kept repairing the torn lung tissue. The damaged area slowly knitted itself back together in real time, something that normally would have taken days, mostly because human biology is apparently ridiculous. Meanwhile, Drimka had started stabilizing my arm fracture. Her tentacles worked carefully around the jagged edges of bone. "Your species does not simply work out," Talriven muttered while adjusting the device. "Your species apparently trains by fighting apex predators and then complaining about being hungry afterward." "To be fair," I said, "I wasn't planning on fighting it. I was just walking back from the gym when it jumped me." "Walking back from the gym," Talriven repeated. He sighed. "Of course. Why wouldn't you finish exercising immediately before fighting for your life?" "Hey," I said, "leg day doesn't schedule itself." Talriven made a strange sound that confused the translator chip for a moment, before it finally translated it as exasperated disgust mixed with professional concern. He had been stationed on the Stellaris outpost for 6 cycles now, ever since the Galactic Council decided that working with humanity was somehow a good idea. He'd already treated plenty of humans during that time. He'd patched up their bizarre injuries. He'd listened to their completely unreasonable explanations. And eventually, he'd come to accept a simple truth. Earth was clearly a death world, and it had produced a species of absolute maniacs. But even for humans, this situation felt like a new level. "The fracture has been aligned," Drimka announced. Her voice wobbled like gelatin about to melt. "But, Doctor, I'm seeing something unusual." "What now?" Talriven asked tiredly. "The bone fragments are already starting to fuse together." "Without nanite assistance?" he asked. "Yes." "Of course they are," Talriven sighed. "Why wouldn't they be? Apparently, human bones simply repair themselves out of pure spite." "It's actually because of the periosteum and the high calcium density," I said helpfully, "plus probably all the milk I drank growing up." "Milk?" Talriven asked cautiously. "Yeah," I explained. "Baby cow juice." At that point, Talriven decided it was safer for his mental stability not to examine that phrase too closely. The lung repair finished a moment later. The tissue now looked healthy and pink instead of shredded and bleeding. Talriven ran another internal scan to check for additional bleeding. There was still some, but it was already clotting, because apparently human blood eventually just decides it's done leaking and fixes the problem itself. "The concussion is now the primary concern," Talriven said as he moved over to examine my head. The bruises there were impressive, a whole spectrum of purple, blue, and yellow that clearly meant I'd taken some serious hits. "You need rest," he said firmly. "Complete rest. No activity, no stimulation, and at least 48 hours under medical observation." I nodded, then instantly regretted it. "Yeah," I said, wincing, "about that." "I do not like the sound of that," Talriven replied. "I've got a training session tomorrow with the new recruits." "Absolutely not." "Come on, Doc. It's important. We're teaching them hand-to-hand combat. You have a brain injury." "A small one." "There is no such thing as a small brain injury." "You keep saying that about all my injuries," I pointed out, "but I'm still here. So clearly there's some wiggle room in your definitions." Talriven opened his mouth to argue, then he stopped, because unfortunately the human had a point. I was still alive, still conscious, still joking around, still functioning despite having enough injuries to kill most species several times over. Officer Zareth shifted awkwardly. "The human may have a point, Doctor," he said. "We have observed that their recovery times are unusual." "Unusual?" Talriven snapped, spinning around to face the Kelvorian officer while his tendrils vibrated with pure frustration. "Last week, one of your humans fell from a 30-meter maintenance platform and shattered both of his legs. 3 days later, he was running again." He lifted several tendrils for emphasis. 3 days. Do you have any idea how long a Kelvorian would take to recover from injuries like that? No one answered. 3 months, he continued, and that's with full medical assistance. "Yeah," I said with a grin. "Humans are pretty resilient." I shrugged carefully. "We kind of have to be. Earth, well, it's not exactly the safest place in the galaxy." That was the kind of understatement that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. Earth was officially classified as a Class 12 death world, a rating reserved for planets that were barely survivable and generally avoided by sensible species. And yet, somehow, that planet had produced a biosphere packed with creatures that all seemed designed to kill each other in creative and imaginative ways. Humans had evolved on a world where the weather itself tried to murder them, where the wildlife regularly considered them food, where even the plants sometimes turned out to be poisonous, carnivorous, or otherwise dangerous. And instead of giving up, humans thrived. They looked at that nightmare environment and decided to domesticate some predators, eat the rest, and eventually establish themselves as the planet's apex predator, mostly through stubbornness and an almost supernatural ability to throw things really, really well. "I'm keeping you overnight for observation," Talriven finally said, clearly playing the last card he had, "and you will rest." "That is not a request." "Fine," I sighed. "But can someone bring me something to eat? I wasn't kidding about being hungry." "I'll have the cafeteria send something," Drimka volunteered quickly. She immediately floated toward the communication panel like she couldn't wait to escape the room. The next few hours passed relatively quietly. Talriven completed the entire treatment protocol, applying regenerative compounds, scanning my vitals repeatedly, and documenting everything in obsessive detail. He was pretty sure the case would end up as a medical study that confused xenobiologists for the next decade. As for me, I ate enough food to feed a Quillarian for an entire week. I cracked several jokes about my injuries that made Talriven's tendrils curl in visible distress. Then, without much ceremony, I fell asleep, sitting upright, and I snored. Of course I did. Talriven eventually retreated to his office and began reviewing human medical files again. He'd read them before. Several times, actually, but every new encounter with humans seemed to reveal another disturbing surprise about our biology: redundant systems, extreme adaptability, the ability to keep functioning through injuries that would completely incapacitate other species. A healing response that often seemed powered purely by stubborn determination. And the psychological reports were even worse. Humans bonded with everything. They befriended predators. They gave names to their weapons. They sang cheerful songs about disasters and death. They even practiced something called extreme sports, which appeared to be recreational activities specifically designed to tempt fate. "They're insane," Talriven muttered to himself. "All of them." Unfortunately, they were also his patients. He looked through the window of his office toward the observation room. I was sleeping peacefully despite having been minutes away from dying less than 4 hours earlier. My chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm. That repaired lung was working overtime. My broken arm remained immobilized, but the healing process had already started. By tomorrow, I'd probably try to leave. I'd probably succeed. And within a week, I'd likely be back in the gym lifting weights heavy enough to flatten a Kelvorian, preparing, as always, for whatever ridiculous disaster came next. Because that was what humans did. They broke, they healed, and then they came back stronger. It was terrifying. It was completely illogical, and, Tal Riven admitted this very quietly to himself, it was a little impressive. Just a little. Of course, he would never tell a human that. Their egos were already dangerously detached from reality. The next morning began with what Tal Riven had privately started calling the Daily Human Incident Report. In practical terms, it was just a list of all the ways the station's human population had shocked, horrified, or confused everyone else during the previous 24 hours. Today's highlights were memorable. One human had repaired a leaking plasma conduit using their bare hands, suffering third-degree burns and then complaining about missing breakfast. Another had gone for a casual jog in the high-gravity training chamber, which had been set to twice Earth's normal gravity. And the third case involved a human who had broken up a violent fight between two Kravik soldiers simply by stepping between them and refusing to move. The Kraviks were 3 meters tall and strong enough to crush most species without effort. The human involved was a woman named Jordan Navarro. She stood maybe 1.7 meters tall. According to her personnel file, her hobbies included kickboxing and baking sourdough bread with equal enthusiasm. The Kraviks had apologized to her. Tal Riven was still trying to mentally process that fact when Drimka suddenly oozed into his office. Her body trembled in a way he had learned meant barely contained panic. "Doctor," she said urgently, "we have a problem." "Is it Adrian?" Tal Riven asked immediately, already standing up and grabbing his scanner. "Did he try to leave?" "No," Drimka said. "He's still in the observation room." Tal Riven relaxed slightly. "Then what is the problem?" Drimka hesitated. "He's doing push-ups." Tal Riven blinked. "He's doing what?" "Push-ups," she repeated, "with his good arm." She quivered again. "He says he needs to maintain his fitness routine and that the broken arm doesn't count because he still has another one." Tal Riven made a noise that probably violated several galactic communication standards. "I'm going to sedate him." Drimka shook nervously. "That's the problem, Doctor. You can't." "What do you mean I can't?" he demanded. "I am the chief medical officer. I can absolutely sedate an uncooperative patient." Drimka rippled anxiously. "His metabolism is too fast. He processes the sedatives faster than we can administer them." She paused. "I already tried a standard dose earlier when he started doing something he called core exercises. It worked for about 12 minutes, and then he woke up and asked for breakfast." This, Tal Riven decided, was a nightmare. He had studied medicine for 6 years on cholera prime. He had completed advanced xenobiology programs. He had written a thesis on comparative respiratory systems that had received respectable academic praise. At no point during his education had anyone warned him about patients who exercised their way through life-threatening injuries. When he reached Observation Room 3, the situation was exactly as Drimka described. I was on the floor, doing one-armed push-ups. The broken arm remained suspended in its stabilization field against my chest, while my other arm worked steadily. My form suggested this was not my first time doing this. 47, 48, 49, 50. I dropped to the floor after that last push-up, breathing hard but grinning like an idiot. "New personal record," I said between breaths. "Post-injury push-ups." "That is not a record anyone should be proud of," Talriven snapped. His tendrils were vibrating so fast they were practically humming. "You are supposed to be resting." "I am resting," I said, pushing myself upright. "I only did 50. Normally, I do 200. I wiped sweat off my forehead with my good hand. "Besides, I feel fine," I added. "Actually, I feel great. Whatever you did to my lung worked perfectly. Breathing's a lot easier now." "Of course breathing is easier," Talriven replied sharply. "I repaired the hole that was preventing you from breathing." "Right," I said with a nod. "And I appreciate that, Doc. Seriously." I stood up and stretched a little. "But since I'm good now, I figured I might head out, grab some breakfast, and check in with my unit." "You have a healing fracture, a recently repaired lung, and a concussion that could still cause severe complications," he said slowly. I tested my balance. For a second I swayed, then steadied myself and tried a couple of experimental squats. "Concussion seems fine," I said. "No dizziness, no nausea, vision's clear." Then I shrugged. "I've had worse." Talriven blinked. "You have had worse?" "Yeah," I said casually. "Back in basic training, I caught a rifle butt to the head during a combat drill. That was a real concussion. Couldn't remember my own name for about 6 hours." I waved a hand. This is nothing." Something inside Talriven broke at that moment. Not physically, though given the stress he was under, that might have been next. It was more psychological. A quiet realization that humans existed outside normal medical logic and that trying to treat us like sensible patients was probably a losing battle. "Fine," he said at last, sounding completely defeated. "But you will wear a medical monitor. You will check in every 4 hours, and if you experience any symptoms, you return immediately." "Deal," I said. I extended my hand for a handshake. Talriven wrapped one of his tendrils around my hand and awkwardly completed the gesture, trying very hard not to think about how strong my grip still was despite the injuries. A few minutes later, I left the medical wing at what I considered a brisk walk. Talriven, watching from the doorway, would probably have called it a light jog. Either way, I moved with the confidence of someone who hadn't nearly died the day before. The rest of Talriven's morning went back to normal. He treated a Sulvane suffering from digestive trouble, a Kelvorian with a strained wing joint, and a Threxian dealing with a mild case of scale rot. Simple cases, normal injuries, the kind of problems that made sense. Then lunchtime happened. The station alarm suddenly screamed to life with a piercing wail that made Talriven drop his medical pad. Red emergency lights flooded the corridors. His communicator crackled. "Medical emergency in Cargo Bay 7, announced the voice of Commander Kairoth, the station's Threxian commanding officer. "Multiple casualties. Structural collapse. Medical teams respond immediately." Talriven grabbed his emergency kit and ran. Drimka flowed quickly behind him, moving surprisingly fast for someone who technically didn't have legs. When they reached Cargo Bay 7, the scene looked like pure chaos. A major support beam had failed, bringing down several tons of equipment. Twisted metal and smashed cargo containers covered the floor like a disaster zone. Security teams were already pulling injured workers from the wreckage. Talriven quickly assessed the situation. 3 Kelvorians with crushed limbs, 2 Sulvanes with ruptured membrane sacs, 1 Threxian with a compound fracture that looked bad even by human standards, and right in the center of the wreckage was Adrian. I was standing beneath a partially collapsed section of ceiling, and I was holding up a support beam with one arm. My broken arm hung uselessly at my side, still trapped in the stabilization field. But somehow, I'd wedged myself under a section of debris and was supporting what had to be at least 500 kilograms of metal and composite materials. My face was red from the strain, veins bulged in my neck, my muscles trembled violently. Under the beam I was holding up, 2 Calarian engineers were trapped alive but pinned beneath the wreckage. "Little help here would be great," I called out. My voice sounded strained, but somehow I still managed that familiar human cheerfulness. "Because, this thing is really heavy." Officer Zareth and 3 other Kelvorians rushed forward carrying emergency support struts. It took them 90 seconds to secure the structure. 90 seconds! For that entire minute and a half, I held the weight up, using nothing but human stubbornness and muscles that apparently didn't understand the concept of limits. Once the struts were locked in place, I stumbled backward. I caught myself, then immediately moved to help the trapped engineers crawl free. That was the exact moment Talriven arrived, and it was also the moment the adrenaline started to wear off. My face went from red to pale in about 3 seconds. My eyes unfocused. My legs started shaking. "Oh," I said quietly, "I think I might have overdone it." Then I collapsed. Talriven caught me with his tendrils before I hit the ground and carefully lowered me down. His scanner was already active, projecting a diagnostic image that made all 3 of his stomachs clench. The fracture had reopened. The lungs showed clear signs of stress. The concussion had worsened. My heart rate was dangerously high. My blood pressure was crashing, and my body temperature was climbing toward catastrophic levels. "Get me a medical pod now," Talriven shouted, all professional calm completely gone. "Can someone tell me what happened?" One of the rescued engineers, a young Quilarian named Alira, staggered forward. "The support beam failed," she explained breathlessly. "We were trapped underneath. Then the human appeared." She pointed toward me. "He lifted it. He just lifted the beam and held it so we could escape." Of course he did, Talriven thought bitterly, because humans apparently saw collapsing structures as an opportunity for heroism, instead of a situation where self-preservation might be wise. The medical pod arrived seconds later. 4 security officers carried it in, their expressions still shaken. They loaded me inside carefully while Talriven rapidly programmed the emergency treatment protocols. "Full cellular regeneration," he ordered. "Emergency cardiovascular support." "Neural stabilization," Talriven continued, programming the last of the emergency treatments into the medical pod. He activated every system his medical bay had available for a patient who apparently believed that holding up collapsing structures was a perfectly reasonable decision. "Will he survive?" Alira asked quietly. The young Quilarian wrapped her tendrils tightly around herself, clearly shaken. Talriven looked down at the human lying inside the pod. Adrian's vital signs were already beginning to stabilize. That ridiculous human biology had kicked into what looked like some kind of emergency repair mode. His healing response was activating, redundant systems were compensating, and his stubborn refusal to die seemed to be overriding several basic rules of medicine. "Yes," Talriven said after a moment, and to his own surprise, he realized he meant it. "He'll survive," he added, because humans, apparently, simply didn't understand the concept of staying down. The trip back to the medical bay felt tense. Talriven stared at the medical pod's readouts the entire time, watching Adrian's body perform what could only be described as medical miracles. The fracture that had reopened was already beginning to mend. The lung damage was reversing. Even the concussion showed signs of slowly improving. It took 6 hours. 6 hours for Adrian to move from critical condition back to stable. 6 hours during which Talriven questioned every assumption he had ever made about biology, medicine, and the basic fairness of the universe. When Adrian finally opened his eyes, the first words out of his mouth were not, "Where am I?" or "What happened?" Instead, he asked, "Did everyone make it out okay?" His first concern was for the others. "Everyone survived," Talriven replied quietly. "Thanks to you." He pulled up the incident report. "You held approximately 530 kilograms of structural debris for 93 seconds while rescue teams deployed supports. "Oh, good," Adrian murmured. He tried to sit up, failed miserably, and sank back onto the bed. "That's good," he said. "I was worried I wouldn't be able to hold it long enough." "You reopened your arm fracture," Talriven said flatly. "You pushed your repaired lung nearly to failure, worsened your concussion, and nearly died again." He paused. "For the second time in 2 days." Adrian blinked. "But everyone's okay?" "Yes," Talriven sighed. "Everyone is okay." He pointed a tendril at Adrian. "Everyone except you, who appears determined to commit suicide through excessive heroism." Adrian actually laughed at that. It was a weak laugh, but still clearly amused. "Sorry, Doc," he said. He shrugged slightly. "It's kind of a human thing. When somebody's in trouble, you help. You don't really stop to think about it." "You should think about it," Talriven insisted. "You should think about the fact that you have injuries, that you have limits." "Yeah, probably." Adrian closed his eyes again, clearly exhausted. "But those engineers were trapped," he murmured. "So, not really a choice." And that was the difference. That was the fundamental thing that separated humans from almost every other species in the galaxy. When most species faced danger, they calculated the risks. They assessed the odds. They made rational survival decisions. Humans didn't do that. Humans just helped. They saw someone in danger, and their first instinct wasn't self-preservation. It was protection. They would charge into danger without hesitation, fight impossible odds, endure pain and injury without complaint, all because someone else needed help. It was stupid. It was irrational. And as Talriven stood there quietly in the medical bay, he had to admit something to himself. It was the most remarkable thing he had ever seen. The door slid open with a hiss. Commander Kairoth stepped inside. The Threxian officer was enormous, covered in heavy scales and carrying the natural presence of someone used to command. But when he approached Adrian's bed, he moved with careful respect. "How is he?" the commander asked. "Alive," Talriven replied, "despite his best efforts to the contrary." Kairoth glanced at the unconscious human. "The Calarian engineers claim he saved their lives," the commander said. "Is that accurate?" "Unfortunately, yes," Talriven answered. "He held up a collapsing section of ceiling so they could escape." He sighed. "Then he collapsed himself, because, apparently, humans believe consequences should arrive later." Kairoth's tail swished slightly, a Threxian gesture that signaled approval. "I'm submitting him for a commendation," the commander said. "What he did was incredibly brave." "It was incredibly stupid," Talriven corrected. "He had injuries severe enough that he should not have even been standing," the doctor continued, "and yet he attempted extreme physical exertion anyway." "And still succeeded," Kairoth said calmly. "That," the commander added, "is humanity." He studied Adrian thoughtfully. "When the Galactic Council first proposed including humans in our joint operations program, many of us were skeptical." He paused. "Deathworlders have a reputation. Violent, unpredictable, dangerous." "They are all of those things," Talriven agreed. "But they are also this," Kairoth said. He gestured toward Adrian. "They possess courage that ignores calculation. Strength used to protect others." He gave a small nod. "They are the species that looks at impossible odds and says, 'Not today.'" His tail swished once more. "I am glad they are on our side." The commander left a moment later, leaving Talriven alone with his unconscious patient. The doctor ran another scan. Adrian's body continued to respond to treatment with baffling efficiency. At this rate, the human would likely wake up within a few hours, and the first thing he'd probably do was complain about being hungry. Then, within a day or two, he would almost certainly try to leave the medical bay again. And knowing humans, he would probably succeed. Drimka oozed into the room holding a data pad. "Doctor," she said, "I've finished compiling the incident reports." "And?" Talriven asked. "The total number of lives saved by the humans' intervention was 7. She glanced down at the screen. 2 Calarians, 3 Kelvorians who were in the collapse path, and 2 Solvanes who would have been crushed if the debris had fallen differently. 7 lives, 7 people who would have died if Adrian hadn't been there, if he hadn't ignored his injuries, if he hadn't made the completely irrational, completely human choice to help anyway." "Make a note in his file," Talriven said slowly. Drimka waited. "Patient Adrian Locke demonstrates a typical human response to crisis situations." He paused. "Irrational courage, extreme physical exertion beyond recommended biological limits, and a complete disregard for personal safety when others are in danger." Drimka blinked. "Is that a medical diagnosis?" "No," Talriven admitted. "That's just what humans do." He returned to his office and sat down, looking out through the window into the medical bay where his impossible patient slept. Tomorrow, Adrian would wake up. He would probably make jokes. He would definitely try to leave early, and sooner or later, he would end up back in the medical bay with another ridiculous injury acquired while doing something heroic and stupid. Because humans were different. They were built to endure, to persist, to survive things that should have killed them, and then get back up and do it all over again. They were evolution's answer to a hostile universe. A species that had looked at a world constantly trying to kill them and decided to thrive anyway. They were terrifying. They were impossible. And as Talriven began writing his daily medical report, he realized something, Humans might actually be the reason the galaxy had a chance against whatever dangers waited out there in the darkness between the stars. Of course, he would never say that out loud. Their egos were already large enough. But as he watched Adrian's vital signs continue improving and documented yet another completely impossible recovery, Talriven allowed himself a quiet moment of gratitude.